The hum of the boardroom always carried a certain rhythm on Monday mornings, paper shuffling, keyboards clicking, the faint hiss of the espresso machine down the hall. I had walked into that room for 15 years with the same ritual coffee in my right hand, notes tucked under my left arm, nameplate steady at the head of the table. But that morning, the nameplate was gone. Instead, Adam Royce lounged in my chair, his legs stretched across the polished wood like he owned the place. He tilted his phone at just the right angle, his hair slicked with that careless shine, and tapped out a caption I could see reflected in the boardroom screen, "All mine soon." He hit post without a second thought. The partners laughed nervously, the kind of laughter that tries to mask discomfort but ends up sounding like complicity. I didn't move. My chair, 15 years of late nights, of holiday weekends sacrificed, of crises averted, had been reduced to a photo prop. I lowered my coffee to the table and slipped quietly into a seat along the side. That's when I noticed the projector. On the screen, Adam's presentation flickered to life. A bold chart stretched upward, promising double-digit returns for the next 2 quarters. My chest tightened. I had seen those numbers before months ago. In an early draft, I had flagged in red for being dangerously unrealistic. The market assumptions were hollow, built on projections that ignored compliance thresholds. I had written a 3-page memo warning of the risks, and now, here it was again, resurrected, dressed up in glossy formatting, with Adam pointing at the rising curve like he'd just reinvented Wall Street. "This," he announced with a grin, "is my vision for the firm's future." No one corrected him. No one even glanced my way. The room buzzed with forced nods, partners clicking their pens, assistants typing notes that wouldn't hold up under a single regulator's glare. I sipped my coffee, willing my face into a mask of calm, though my pulse thudded in my ears. I knew in that moment that Adam wasn't just stealing a seat. He was playing with fire, and everyone was pretending it was a candle. I let my gaze linger on the chart, then on Adam's self-satisfied grin. The chair was gone, the nameplate erased, the numbers twisted into theater. But the real work was still mine, waiting to be defended. When I first joined the firm, the Chicago office was a crumbling shell. The merger that was supposed to save it had nearly sunk us instead. And I spent endless nights poring over spreadsheets until my eyes blurred. There were weeks I lived on vending machine coffee and the quiet hum of copy machines, trying to reconcile numbers that refused to balance. I told myself it was temporary, that the sacrifices would pay off. By 2008, when the crash came like a hurricane ripping through Wall Street, I had already relocated to New York to help rebuild. I remember standing in the dim glow of Times Square at 3 a.m, dialing clients who were terrified their fortunes had vanished overnight. Somehow, with patience and precision, I held enough hands steady to keep the firm breathing. Vacations disappeared, relationships thinned out, and eventually broke under the weight of my hours. My father passed, and I was still on a conference call. The few friends I kept stopped asking me to dinner because they knew I would decline. My life narrowed to ledgers, contracts, and the constant discipline of keeping other people's chaos from spilling into collapse. Gregory Royce, then already CEO, once told me over a rare glass of wine, "Your infrastructure, Marina, invisible, but essential." He meant it as praise. I took it as duty. Stability became my identity. I didn't need the spotlight. I believed the work would always speak louder than anything else. But that was before hashtags became resumes and viral posts replaced quarterly reports. Now Gregory beams at his son as if a last name and an expensive MBA could replace decades of scars. Adam struts through corridors, throwing buzzwords like confetti, never once worrying about the weight of the promises he makes. And Gregory, blind with paternal pride, calls it vision. Sitting at the edge of that boardroom table, I finally understood the bitter truth: results don't trend. Noise does. And Adam had the loudest voice in the room, while I had only silence. But silence, I reminded myself, can carry its own kind of power. Adam's presence in the office was impossible to miss. He strode through the corridors as if the firm had been built for him, handing out promises like candy. Junior analysts nodded, pretending to admire his certainty, while senior staff kept their heads down, unwilling to risk Gregory's wrath by pointing out his son's blunders. One afternoon, as I walked past the glass conference pods on the 12th floor, I caught his voice rising above the hum of phones. He was pacing in circles, headset on, pitching to a client whose name made me stop cold: Charles Winthrop. Charles was old money, the kind of man who still signed checks with a fountain pen. I had guided him through 2 recessions and countless volatile quarters. He trusted my numbers because I never oversold, never dressed up risk as opportunity. I lingered by the frosted glass, listening as Adam promised returns that defied every compliance boundary we lived by. Double-digit growth on instruments that weren't even cleared, guarantees of safety where none existed. He laughed, as if the call were a friendly chat rather than a fiduciary contract. I felt heat rise in my chest. This wasn't bravado. This was liability, the kind that regulators pounce on, the kind that unravels firms overnight. When the call ended, I slipped back to my office, closed the door, and pulled up the system log. Every call was recorded, every draft proposal archived. I downloaded the files quietly, labeling them with the precision of someone who had learned long ago that evidence must be kept clean. I didn't do it out of spite. I did it because Adam's arrogance was leaving footprints, and footprints led somewhere. If no one else was willing to see it, I would that evening. I slid the printed transcript into a growing folder in my desk drawer, the pages stacked beside earlier notes and overlooked deadlines. Insurance, I told myself, not revenge. Insurance against exactly this. Because arrogance never walks alone, it drags recklessness behind it, and recklessness always leaves a trail that someone like me knows how to follow. The folder had been sitting in the back of the archive room for months, wedged between compliance binders no one touched unless regulators came knocking. The fluorescent light above me flickered, casting a pale buzz across the rows of steel cabinets. I had walked these aisles before, searching for clarity when the world outside seemed determined to erase me. This time, I found more than clarity. 6 months earlier, during the scandal that nearly sank us, the board had been cornered. A partner was caught hiding losses. Clients threatened mass withdrawals, and regulators circled. Gregory needed stability, not bluster. So the vote was taken quietly: appoint me interim managing partner until the storm passed. It wasn't ceremony, it was survival. And in that moment, they trusted me more than anyone. The resolution was signed, dated, filed, copies sent to the SEC, noted in federal filings. And then, as the scandal faded and Adam strutted into the spotlight, no one bothered to undo what they had done. On paper, in the only place that mattered to regulators and courts, I still held the authority Adam claimed as his birthright. I held the document in my hands. The ink faded but undeniable. My name, printed neatly where his should have been. Adam's power was an illusion, born of assumption and noise. He sat in my chair because people were too afraid to stop him, not because the law gave him the right. I slipped the resolution into my folder, the same one now holding transcripts of his reckless calls and copies of his unsigned promises. Insurance stacked on insurance, each page heavier than the last. For the first time in months, I felt the ground tilt back beneath my feet, steady and solid. Not because I shouted louder, but because I had proof. The tide hadn't just shifted, it had always been mine to command. I closed the cabinet, locked the folder under my arm, and walked out of the archive with a calm smile. The next time Adam leaned back in my chair, I would not need to argue. I would only need to press send. The boardroom was packed tighter than usual, the air heavy with expectation. Adam had insisted on presenting his vision for the upcoming merger, striding to the front as though the carpet itself bowed beneath his shoes. He gestured at the glossy slides, pointing to projections pulled from the very numbers I had once dismissed as reckless. The partners nodded, some eager, others fearful, all pretending his performance was more than smoke. I sat near the end of the table, my folder balanced neatly on my lap. Every laugh Adam coaxed from the room felt thinner than the last. Every promise he made stretched further than compliance would ever allow. I didn't need to interrupt him. Arrogance always writes its own downfall. When he finally leaned back in my chair with that familiar smirk, I opened my laptop and typed a short message. 4 lines. No accusations, no raised voice, just the resolution from 6 months ago, the attachments that confirmed it, and the line that mattered most. Per board filing, interim managing partner authority remains with Marina Caldwell until reversed by vote. I pressed send. The minutes that followed were quiet enough to hear the air conditioning hum. Then the door swung open with a sharp crack. Harold Kane, the firm's senior counsel, strode in, his tie crooked, his face pale as paper. He didn't glance at Adam. He didn't even acknowledge the partners scribbling fake notes. Instead, he walked directly to Gregory Royce, phone shaking in his hand. "Read this," Harold muttered. Gregory scanned the screen. His expression shifted in stages: confusion, then shock, then fury. The color drained from his face before it surged back, red and blotchy. His fist hit the table with a crack that silenced even Adam. "Call her." Now he barked, the words ricocheting off the glass walls. I lifted my coffee to my lips, the bitter taste grounding me as the room froze. No one moved. Not the partners, not the assistants, not even Adam, whose smirk faltered into something closer to fear. I didn't look up from my cup. I didn't need to. The message had already been delivered, and its echo was only beginning to spread. By the next morning, the building no longer sounded like business as usual. Phones rang too often, doors shut too quickly, and whispers trailed through hallways like smoke curling under doors. Assistants exchanged nervous glances as they carried stacks of files from one office to another, their arms shaking just enough to betray the fear. I could hear Harold Kane's voice echoing from behind closed doors, clipped and sharp, speaking to regulators who had already caught wind of the filings I had surfaced. The merger, once paraded as inevitable, was suddenly on ice. Partners whispered about clients hesitating, about emails from compliance officers requesting clarifications no one was prepared to give. My inbox filled faster than I could delete. And then one message landed like a spark on dry grass. A junior analyst, new, nervous, too green to know better, had accidentally copied me on an internal thread. Attached was a draft contract Adam had already released to the press weeks ago. The file was glaring in its incompleteness, unsigned, missing essential approvals. Nothing but a shell paraded as fact. In the wrong light, it looked like fraud. In the right light, it was still fraud. I printed the document, slipped it into my folder, and walked calmly into Gregory's office. He was pacing, jaw tight, phone buzzing on his desk. Adam sat slouched in the corner, tapping his pen with forced confidence. Gregory gestured at the pages in my hand, his tone dismissive. "It's symbolic paperwork. Nothing more." I let the silence stretch before answering. Then show me the reversal vote. The room stilled. Adam stopped tapping his pen. Harold, standing near the window, avoided my eyes. Gregory's mouth tightened, but no words came. Silence can be louder than shouting. In that moment, the weight of everything unsaid pressed down on the office until even Gregory's pride seemed to buckle. I slid the unsigned contract onto his desk, its absence of ink screaming louder than any argument, and I knew, as I walked out, that fear had only begun to spread. By Wednesday morning, the board's desperation was impossible to disguise. Harold Kane met me outside the main conference room, his tie askew, dark circles carved under his eyes. Behind him, 2 outside counsel had already spread binders across the table, their pages marked with frantic tabs. "Marina," Harold began, lowering his voice. "We need you to sign a ratification. Limited scope, just enough to stabilize the markets inside." The partners sat stiffly, their faces drawn. The swagger of last week replaced with the gray pallor of people who had been up all night watching numbers bleed across screens. I placed my folder on the table, folded my hands, and waited. One of the outside attorneys spoke first, carefully measured. "We're asking you to acknowledge, formally, that Adam has been acting in practice. A ratification. Retroactive." I felt the word retroactive stick in the air like smoke. I leaned forward. "If you want my signature, there are conditions." The room shifted uneasily. "First," I said, "an accurate filing today that acknowledges my designation since April and the absence of any reversal. Second, written protections for junior staff, no scapegoating assistants or analysts for decisions they never made. Third, a transparent notice to clients, no cosmetic statements. The truth, silence, the kind that tightens throats." Adam finally broke it with a laugh, thin and strained. "Do you want a parade?" I turned to him. "Steady. I want the truth on paper. The place you tried to erase me." His smirk faltered. Gregory's jaw worked, but he said nothing. Harold rubbed his temples as if he already knew there was no other path. The partners exchanged glances, each calculating what collapse would cost them personally. No one moved toward the door. No one offered an alternative. I gathered my folder and stood. "You have my terms. Choose honesty or choose collapse." But the clock is already ticking. And with that, I left them staring at the signatures they needed but could not control. Saturday morning, the board gathered in the largest conference room, stripped of the usual pastries and small talk. The table was bare except for neat stacks of filings and the thin white card set in front of me. Marina Caldwell, acting managing partner. My name had returned, not because anyone wanted it there, but because the law had demanded it. Harold cleared his throat and began, "As it stands, the filings with the SEC confirm Ms. Caldwell's designation as interim managing partner since April. That authority has not been reversed." He paused, and the silence pressed heavier than any gavel. Adam slouched in the corner, his tie loose, his eyes shadowed. Gregory sat at the head, jaw clenched, fingers drumming the table as though force could alter signatures already on record. Then the outside counsel flipped to a separate section of the filings. "Additionally," he said, eyes scanning the pages, "Ms. Caldwell retains international signatory authority, which means," he hesitated, glancing toward Adam, "which means the agreements Mr. Royce announced overseas are not legally binding." The blood drained from Adam's face. Partners shifted in their seats, whispers breaking like cracks in ice. Every deal he had flaunted, every photograph shaking hands in foreign boardrooms, dissolved in that single sentence. I let the murmurs settle before speaking. "I will sign the transition today. But before I do, The minutes must reflect protections for all junior staff. No assistant or analyst will be sacrificed to cover mistakes they didn't make. The secretary's pen scratched across paper as the words were added. I took the resolution, read it carefully, and then placed my signature beneath. The room exhaled like it had been holding its breath for months. Adam stayed silent. His bravado emptied, his pen tapping nervously without rhythm. Gregory's jaw tightened further, but he said nothing. I closed the folder, slid it back across the table, and rose from my chair. The crown had never been his. It had been mine all along, and I was ready to set it down, but on my terms. The silence after my signature lingered, thick and unsettled. Partners shifted in their seats, unsure if they should thank me or resent me. I spared them the choice. I stood, smoothed my jacket, and let my gaze rest on Adam. His eyes darted away, his shoulders hunched. The swagger finally drained from him. Gregory clenched his fists against the table, jaw locked as if he could grind his way back into control. I spoke evenly, my voice carrying just enough to fill the room. I don't burn things to sit in ashes. I build and I leave when the work is done. The words settled over them like a closing bell. No anger, no gloating, just truth. I gathered my folder, nodded to Harold, and walked out of the conference room without looking back. The hallway seemed brighter, the hum of the building softer. When I pushed through the glass doors into the street, the autumn air wrapped around me, crisp and clean, carrying the faint smell of roasted chestnuts from a vendor down the block. For the first time in years, I wasn't walking toward another crisis. I was simply walking away. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A new email lit the screen, Sterling and Ashcroft. The subject line read, "We'd like to talk. A rival firm with resources, reach, and the foresight to see value where others had tried to erase it." I let the corner of my mouth lift. Not from vengeance, but from release. This wasn't triumph over Gregory or Adam. It was freedom from them. The freedom to choose where my energy went, who deserved my steadiness, and who had squandered it. I tucked the phone away, inhaled the cool air, and kept walking, the city bustling around me as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But I knew better. The real victory wasn't in their collapse. It was in the simple act of stepping into my own future unburdened. That evening, I returned to my Brooklyn apartment, the place that had quietly held me through years of exhaustion and solitude. My tabby cat was already curled on the windowsill, tail flicking lazily as the city's lights began to glow against the fading sky. I poured a glass of wine, the cheap kind I'd grown accustomed to, and let the first sip ease the tension from my chest. The day replayed in fragments: the boardroom, the signatures, Adam's silence, Gregory's clenched jaw. But they no longer weighed me down. Their anger, their pride, their illusions of power, they belonged to them, not to me. I glanced at the folder on my kitchen table, now thinner without the resolution I had finally put back in their hands. The papers that once felt like a shield had become proof of something greater. Arrogance can trend for a moment, but paper lasts longer. Hashtags fade, smirks vanish, but filings and signatures outlive noise. Gregory and Adam would be entangled with regulators for months. Every reckless promise Adam had made, every shortcut he had taken, would now be scrutinized in the unforgiving light of compliance. The board would scramble to preserve what they could, but their empire of noise had already cracked. I, meanwhile, had already stepped away. The email from Sterling and Ashcroft sat unopened on my phone, patient and promising. I wasn't in a hurry. For the first time in years, my future wasn't dictated by someone else's crisis. The cat purred softly, pressing his head against the glass. and I felt something I hadn't in years: peace. I thought of every moment they had tried to erase me, every time silence was mistaken for weakness. And then I smiled, knowing that my truth had never been erased. It had been written in ink all along. Because isn't the quietest justice the one that leaves you free